to mute their microphones. And good evening and welcome. And I'm Carol Walter. I am the chair of the McLean Trees Foundation. And tonight we're going to have what I hope will be the first in a series of talks given by Jim McGlone. And I'm going to introduce him in a minute, but I want to explain a little bit what the idea here is. The idea is to talk to people who work in the field, people who take care of trees and who plant trees. So if I say this because if you have any special concerns or if you are interested in certain families of trees, please send me an email and we might be able to include that in a topic for the next presentation. Tonight, we're going to divide the presentation into two segments. First, we'll hear why trees grow where they do. Jim will talk for about 15 minutes and then he'll take questions. So if you have any questions, please put them in the chat as we go along so Jim can answer them. And then the second part will be on oaks, and more specifically, oaks as yard trees. So there again, if you have questions, Jim will answer them after his presentation. Let me tell you who Jim is. In fact, I think most people know who he is already based on the response we got to when we put out the announcement for this webinar. We got 60 people who registered the first day. So I think people know who Jim is. However, let me just say that he's a certified arborist and he's also an environmental educator. And he worked for 17 years at the Virginia Department of Forestry in Northern Virginia. And there he served as an urban forest conservationist. And among other things, he managed a 500-acre park. So without any further ado, I want to give you the floor, Jim.
Thank you, Carol. Well, as Carol said, hopefully this is going to be a series, and I envision it as always being a two-part seminar. The first part will be about tree care and tree maintenance, and then the second part will highlight a genus or a species of trees, or maybe a collection of them. I've been thinking about some of the things we talk about. But tonight we're going to talk about why trees grow where they do. Now, most people think, and this is not without merit, that trees grow where they get the resources they need. And that is certainly part of what determines where trees grow. For example, trees need at least 20 inches of rain per year. And if we look at an average annual rainfall map of the United States, you can see that in the eastern part of the U.S., total precipitation is generally more than 20 inches per year. And once we get into the western part, it falls off, except in the mountainous regions and the Pacific Northwest. I drew a line here, which is the 100th meridian. And historically, that has been the dividing line between 20 inches of rain per year and less than 20 inches of rain per year. Not only is that important for trees, but that's also the line, or also the divide between what is called dry farming, where you rely on rainfall for moisture for your crops, and irrigated farming. Now that line has moved back and forth over time. Towards the end of the 19th century, that line was further to the west. That's where we got a lot of settlement of the plains states, establishing dry farms because we were in a moist or a wet period. But then that line moved back further east than the 100th meridian in the beginning of the 20th century, and that's what led to the Dust Bowl. Right now, that line is probably a little further east. And yes, it is almost a perfectly straight line from north to south through the United States. So Trees obviously need water, and they grow where they can get enough water. The other things that trees need is carbon dioxide, which they use as part of the process of photosynthesis, which is making the sugars that the tree uses for energy. And they get the carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. This is not a problem for trees at this point in time. Another thing that trees need that most people don't think about is oxygen. Everybody knows that through photosynthesis, trees take in carbon dioxide and they release oxygen. Well, once they have made the sugar goes into the cells, and through the process of cellular respiration, which requires oxygen, they give off carbon dioxide. And they get some of their oxygen from the atmosphere, but a lot of their oxygen comes from soil gases. The other thing they need, I just mentioned, is water, which they use for photosynthesis, for nutrient transport, also for leaf turgor. And I didn't put it on the list, but they also control their microenvironment through the release of water vapor to cool off when it gets really hot. And water comes from the soil. Nutrients are another thing that they need. This is for building new cells. This is for repairing existing cells. And it's also for producing secondary chemicals. And those secondary chemicals have become very important as we start talking about whether or not we should be planting native plants. The secondary chemicals are what largely drive that conversation, because it's these secondary chemicals that our insects and other herbivores have co-evolved with so that they can eat some plants. And it's the secondary chemicals in the non-native plants that make them a poor food source for our native wildlife, especially insects. And 10 years ago, I would have just put soil there as the source. But in the last 10 years, there's been some new research that has emerged that suggests that some plants, especially some trees, are hosting nitrogen fixing bacteria in their leaves, and they're getting some of their metabolic nitrogen from that source. But by and large, they're getting all of their nutrients from the soil. And if you look at this table, especially you look at the column about where the trees are getting their resources, you can see that soil is very important for the trees and will be a determiner of where trees grow. When we look at the soil, the clay and organic matter in the soil is what holds water and nutrients in the root zone. So they're very important, particularly in the topsoil. And unfortunately, we scrape a lot of that topsoil off. Soil structure, which is essentially the pore space of the soil, creates the space where water and oxygen can exist. Excuse me. And what happens in most of our developments is they scrape off the topsoil and they compact the subsoil, which means they're removing a lot of the clay and organic matter that the trees need to hold the nutrients and water, and they are crushing the pores, the large pores, which are supposed to hold oxygen. Now, nutrients in the soil come ultimately from the parent rock that the soil is made from. There are other things, there are other processes that move the nutrients around, but a big determinant of what the nutrient balance in the soil is going to be what the parent material is. If you look at Fairfax and Arlington counties, there is a band of Piedmont which runs from the northwest or northeast corner of Fairfax and Arlington down through Tysons and down to the southwest of Fairfax County. That is primarily granitic rock. Granite and micaceous schist are the main bedrocks there. So that column of granite would be what kind of nutrients you find in the soil. Southeast of that band of Piedmont, we have some coastal plain, which is mostly, I want to be sure you understand, it's sedimentary, not sedimentary rock. So this is, to a large extent, old beaches and old Potomac River bottom that makes up the soils that are basically south of Interstate 95 and Route 1. In the northeast corner of, or northwest corner of Fairfax County, we have what's called the Triassic Basin, which is an old rift valley that formed when Pangea broke up about 200 million years ago. And it's filled in with sediment from the Piedmont and from the Blue Ridge. And so there we do have sedimentary soils or sedimentary or soils that derive from sedimentary rocks, particularly sandstone and shale, with some intrusions that are affecting that. So the different types of geology that we have affects the soils that we have across the region and where trees are going to be found within the region. Another part of it is gravity will work on soils. So this is a schematic of a hill. The gray part is the bedrock, the brown part is the soil. And gravity is going to pull, excuse me, is going to pull soil downhill from the top of the ridge, but it's also going to be pulling clay and organic matter and water down the hill. So what happens is at the top of the hill, you have thin, dry, and fertile soils. At the bottom of the hill, where all of this stuff accumulates and piles up, we tend to have thick, they are rich, but they are wet, and they can be anoxic or hypoxic soils. So it's down at the bottom of the hill that trees have trouble getting the oxygen that they need, especially in their roots. In the middle of the slope, you have the deep, rich, moist, well-drained soils that pretty much every tree really wants to grow in. Problem is, not all soils can be described as being deep, rich, moist, and well-drained. And so some trees have adapted themselves to deal with the stressors that you occur at the top of the hill where you have the thin, dry, and fertile soils, or at the bottom of the hill where you have anoxic soils. And so it's not just about trees growing where they get the resources they need. Trees also grow where they have a comparative advantage over getting those resources, especially in these soils that are stressful, like the dry and fertile soils that you find at the top of the ridge, or the wet anoxic soils at the bottom of the hill. So some of the trees that you find on those dry and fertile sites, and these would be ridges, but it also would be out in the coastal plain where you have sandy soils. What we call the dryland oaks. This is chestnut, post, scarlet, white, black, southern red, northern red oaks. We also would include in this category the coastal oaks, the live oaks, and the laurel oaks, because they're growing on deep, sandy soils where water, especially, is in short supply because it just drains through the soil very quickly. Frequently on these sites, we also see plants in the heath family, things like mountain laurel, native azaleas, blueberries, rhododendrons, huckleberries, and in the southern part of the state, sourwood. Most people don't think of sourwood as a tree, and it is, but it's a tree in the heath family. So it's closely related to, especially the blueberries. Sourwood has the same bell-shaped flowers. We also tend to see pines in these dry and fertile sites, with the exception of pond pine. And pignut hickory kind of is in the transition between those dry and fertile sites and those mid-slope good sites. So typically when you walk down a hill in Fairfax in the Piedmont, you start at the top of the hill where you might have chestnut oak dominance with maybe some white and post oak. And as you move down the hill, you'll see the chestnut oaks start to fall out, and then you'll see the white and the black and the scarlet oaks start to become more prominent, and the southern reds. And then a little further down the hill, you might run into the northern red oaks and the pignut hickories, and they may be mixing with the tulip poplar. And then eventually you run into a band of almost pure tulip poplar. And as I said, these sandy coastal plain sites can have the same characteristics as the upper ridge, the upper elevations in the Piedmont. Piney Grove Preserve, which is a Nature Conservancy site down between Waverly and Wakefield, Virginia, that's being managed for red cockaded woodpeckers. It was, when the Nature Conservancy purchased it, a loblolly pine plantation, but the native forest there is white oak and southern red oak. And then the understory is all blueberries, huckleberries, and rhododendrons. It's a really beautiful place to go, especially in the spring when all those different heaths are in bloom. We also run into something that's called an oak heath forest. This is dominated by those dryland oaks with an understory that is all almost exclusively heath family plants. This picture is from southwestern North Carolina, down near a town called Sapphire. And the forest there is pretty much dryland oaks and eastern white pine, with a shrub layer of deciduous azaleas, rhododendron maximum, and mountain laurel. When you get down to the bottom of the hill, in those sites that are stressful because of low oxygen in the root zone, these are some of the plants you would find. And if you look at this list, you'll notice that some of our common street trees, river birch, swamp white oak, pin oak, willow oak, honey locust, sycamore, and elm, and one that should be used more often, I think, sweet bay magnolia. These are all trees that you find in the floodplain, but do well in your yards. One of them that I didn't call out is bald cypress. So most people think bald cypress needs a lot of water because it grows in standing water. But the reason it grows there is because it is better at dealing with permanently saturated soils where they have very low oxygen. But this is a tree that will grow in your yard and is actually a very beautiful tree. Gets a brilliant orange color, and it is deciduous, and it will drop all those needles, but they are so fine you don't need to rake them. In fact, as you'll see later on, you shouldn't rake your leaves anyway. Then in the mid slope and the coves, and if you've ever heard that expression cove, this is what creates a cove. It's kind of a dip in the bedrock where soil can accumulate and get a little deeper. And this is where, especially in this area, tulip poplar dominates. Basswood is a little bit where it's moving out of the range. Fairfax County is moving out of its range. But some of these other trees you might find growing in these coves. And so where I see, when I was working for the Department of Forestry, where I would see these different species growing, told me something about the soils and the site that I was looking at. There are a few trees, though, that really don't help with that. Red maple black gum and persimmon particularly show up as associates in a large number of forest types. Um, Black cherry is another one that'll grow almost anywhere, as well as black locust, although it's more of a pioneer species that you would find uh, colonizing an old field. So, how does this inform choosing a tree for your yard? Well, unfortunately, as I said, in most cases, your yard has compacted subsoil that is both low in oxygen and has low infiltration. So you're looking at a dry, oxygen poor site. And this is something that is not found much in nature. So there's really no tree that is going to be really happy to grow in your yard. This doesn't mean you shouldn't grow them. It just means it's not the best site for them. On the upside, the reason trees distribute themselves across the landscape the way I've talked about is because of competition. And since you are controlling the competition in your yard, you can plant pretty much any tree that you want. There are very few species that will not at least survive in your yard. They may not thrive, but they'll survive and they'll grow there. What I've talked about today also applies to shrubs and flowers. And when it comes to selecting shrubs and flowers for your yard, the soil characteristics may be more important. For example, in my yard, I have sassafras soils, which is a sandy clay that is fairly acidic. I have a big red maple growing in my yard. And under it, I have what I would consider a typical understory for either an oak heath or an acidic oak hickory forest because of those soils. So there are a lot of shrubs and a lot of flowers and plants that I have tried in my yard and they've died. Tiarella does not grow in my yard. It does not like the acidic soils here. But my azaleas are going gangbusters. They love this acidic soil. So that's something to keep in mind. The other thing is, and as we go through this series, you're going to hear this again and again and again. Turf is the biggest problem for your trees in your yard. Turf likes warm, dry, bacterially dominated soils. Trees like, excuse me, moist, um, cool, fungally dominated soils. And they're both trying to do that. So, whatever species you decide to plant, the best thing to do is to pull the turf back as far as you can stand it and mulch that open area that you have created when you move the turf back so you can plant your tree. Okay, are there any questions? Got to adjust my screens here so I can see. There we go.
I have a question.
Um, Go ahead.
Oh, I was wondering about, you had talked about how the plants get the nutrients that animals that feed off the plants you need to survive from the soil.
Right.
And then you said that that's why you said also though that invasive plants don't do as good a job providing, or I guess the native animals can't use invasive plants in the same way. But I guess I'm just wondering, why aren't the invasive plants pulling the same nutrients out of the soil
They
if
are.
they're in the same
So,
location?
so the problem is the plants are making these things we call secondary chemicals. That
Okay.
would be like tannin or nicotine or salicylic acid. Um, and they create those chemicals to discourage herbivory, right?
Right,
So they take those nutrients and they're making chemicals that taste bad.
right.
all right? And or it tastes bad to some of the especially the insects, but also to mammals and
Mhm.
birds and things. And so what's happening is the suite of chemicals that the non-natives, and keep in mind, I'm saying non-native, not just the invasives, also the non-invasive non-natives, the suite of chemicals they're making are not the insects and other wildlife has not adapted to that suite of chemicals. So those things taste bad and they don't eat them.
Okay, that makes sense. So
Okay.
the trees are actually kind of changing the composition then of the nutrients that they're taking up.
No, they're not. Keep in mind, nutrients are elements. They're building molecules with those atoms that they're getting as nutrients. And
Mhm.
it's the molecules that they're making that taste bad. A good example of this is broccoli. Okay.
Yeah.
Some people think broccoli tastes great. Other people think it tastes awful. The reason people think broccoli tastes bad is because they have the genetic alleles to build the bitter receptor that allows them to taste the chemical that broccoli puts out.
Oh, okay.
So if your kids don't like broccoli, it's your fault because that's a genetic condition. That's not just being a picky eater. That is the body telling people, don't eat this. It may be poisonous.
Oh, interesting. Oh, great. Okay, well, thank you
Okay.
so much. That's fascinating.
That's what's going on with the native and non-native.
Thank
It
you.
also applies to the bees and the nectar and pollen because the plants are putting those secondary chemicals in their nectar and pollen.
Right.
So about 30% of our bees have to have locally native plants that they have evolved with.
Hmm. Okay. Great. Thank you so much. That was
You're
fascinating.
welcome. Okay, now we got some things in the chat.
Oh, okay. Could
Hmm. So Gertrude is asking, can I cover the turf around an oak tree in my yard with mulch? Or must I rip up the turf? I don't want to hurt any tree roots. So yeah, if you already have a tree in the yard, a large tree that has roots that you might disturb by removing the grass, you're probably not going to get rid of the turf just by covering it with, well, yeah, you could, but it's going to take 8 to 12 inches of um, arborist chips. And Gertrude's saying where to get arborist chips. Uh, and Carrie says call an arborist. That's one way. Oh, in modest amounts, that's a little more tricky. That's a little trickier. They usually want to give them to you in
Yeah, 5-yard truckloads.
yes. Um, so that's one way. You can also scalp the grass, which is because the grass roots only go down about 2 or 3 inches. So the only roots you're really going to disturb under the tree are going to be the fine absorbing roots that the tree is constantly growing and shedding. They they grow and shed about the same mass of fine absorbing roots as the leaves that they drop. So those would be the two ways. You could use cardboard or newspaper, but that creates a water and vapor barrier, which is going to be a little bit harmful to the tree because the tree is not going to be getting water and oxygen into the soil around those roots. Um, I will be honest with you, the way I got rid of the grass around my tree roots in my yard was using glyphosate. Um, the reason I would say glyphosate is because it's not soil active. It has to be absorbed through the leaves. So if you spray it on the grass, it's going to get absorbed into the grass There may be some residue that'll go into the soil, but it's not going to get into your tree the way triclopyr or some of the other herbicides will. All right. Let's see. Whoops. I'm trying to move down in the list of questions. Oh, Carrie also mentioned cilantro. Yes. The same deal with broccoli. Some people think cilantro tastes like soap. I'm one of them. Would you recommend planting flowers and other plants close up to around a newish tree? Absolutely. We have a term for that. It's called green mulch. So the difference is, especially if you're using native woodland wildflowers, they like the same kind of soil that trees do. They're also not forming that sod that's going to keep water and oxygen from getting down into the tree roots. This is why you typically um, will find only about 20% of the density of tree roots under turf than you do under whether you're talking about green or brown mulch. So green mulch would be native wildflowers, some shrubs, all that kind of stuff. It's good it works well with the tree. It helps build the soil, helps hold the water in place. Janet is anticipating the second half of the talk. She wants to know if swamp white oaks need to be planted in moisture areas. Not necessarily. They have adaptations to deal with. That's one of the reasons we use them as yard trees, is they have adaptations that help them deal with the compacted soil that we have and the low oxygen there. Probably don't want to plant it in a really, really dry place. Not something you would put at the top of the hill, but mid-slope or lower would be fine. Maureen asks, for those of us who are planting trees in developed areas, should we be focusing on planting those trees that are adapted to hypoxic poor soils, or does the issue of controlling competition level the playing field? To a large extent, the issue of controlling the competition does level the playing fields. As you will see in a few minutes, white oaks are a really good choice for a yard. Even though they are an upland species. So no, you don't have to just look at those riparian species that dominate the landscape. One of the other things about a lot of those riparian species is they do tend to grow fast, which is what everybody wants. But as we'll talk about it, oaks can grow, even upland oaks can grow pretty fast. Is there a best season to put down the 12 inches of wood chips? Not really. The one thing that I've worked with or I've talked with Sam Droege out at the USGSB lab, and he's been doing this where he puts down the 12 inches of wood chips, and then when they stay there for 6 months or longer, and when it comes planting time, all he does is dig a hole in them, and he'll put his plants in so they get at least contact, the bottom of them get contact with the soil under the wood chips. And then they will slowly work their way down into the proper place in the landscape, at least with the herbaceous plants. I wouldn't do that with a woody plant. You need to plant that properly, but you can just scrape away the wood chips and plant it. Yeah. I'm having trouble I've got two screens going here and I can't find my there it is. Um, So Jim Creasy asked, do we have to be very precise with sub-tree plants in terms of specific symbiotic tree plant interactions, or are generally native species good enough? I would say you don't have to be that specific. The Department of Conservation and Recreation in their natural communities or program have a list of different natural communities that'll give you some idea of what plants grow with what trees on what sites. Following that, it's not so much about the symbiotic relationship between the plants. It's more about these plants all like the same kind of conditions. So they're self-selecting rather than they need to be planted near each other. And it looks like maybe there's one. Nope, that's it. Okay, we're going to move on to the majestic oaks, and then we'll have time for more questions after I finish with the majestic oaks. I want to do that. I want to. There we go. Okay. So as I said, oaks are great trees for your yard. They have a lot to recommend them. So they're very versatile. There are several commercially available species of oaks. Any one of them would probably be fine for your yard. One of the things to understand about oaks is that at least here in Northern Virginia, there are two sections. So these are sort of subsections of the genus. There's the white oak section and the red or black oak section. And that leads to some of the versatility of oaks because for any given set of conditions, there can be both a red and a white oak that will fit that. This is why there tend to be a lot more oaks than other species or species in other genuses in Virginia. If you look at common native trees of Virginia, there are about a dozen or more oaks, and none of the other genuses have nearly that many trees represented. They're usually 2 or 3. Oaks also have strong rot-resistant wood. The white oak section is a little more rot-resistant. So if you're worried about the tree getting rot and falling down, go with a white oak. They are wind firm. Here in Northern Virginia, we have no primary pests or diseases of oaks. And that means we don't have any pests or diseases that will attack a healthy, mature oak and kill it. We have a lot of secondary pests and diseases that will go after oaks that are already stressed. And we're seeing a lot of this in Northern Virginia through a process that's called oak decline syndrome, which is essentially the trees get stressed. We've had a lot of very stressful, weird weather over the past 5, 6, 7 years, actually more than that. And we also have a population of oaks that are aging. And so those things make the trees less able to defend themselves. The one exception to what I just said is bacterial leaf scorch, which can affect a mature, healthy oak, particularly the red oaks. That's the bad news. The good news is it can take more than a decade for bacterial leaf scorch to kill a mature tree. It's not something that's going to get into your tree and kill it very quickly. Most of the species provide good shade. I will mention a few that are smaller in stature and would not be considered shade trees, and that are suitable for small spaces as I look at the next bullet. They also tend to increase your property values. If you talk to realtors, they will tell you that planting a shade tree is one of the most cost-effective ways of increasing your property value, especially if you're planning to be in your house for a while. The only downside really to oaks are the acorns, which can be a slip, trip, and fall hazard. And if you are mowing under or mowing an area where there are a lot of acorns present, I suppose they can become projectiles. But there's very little, aside from the acorns, that you can say about oaks. When they are healthy, there are great trees in your yard. They're also a tremendous resource for the wildlife. Um, they support 513 species of caterpillars locally. Those caterpillars then become food for the young birds. About, I think it's 95% of bird species feed their young caterpillars. There are the notable exceptions around here would be the predatory birds and waterfowl. The songbird species that I know of that does not feed its young caterpillars are mourning doves. The leaves decompose slowly and condition the soil, so leaving the leaves, not raking them, which is a bonus, because then that means you have more time to sit around and enjoy your yard and enjoy watching your neighbors while they toil over their leaf blowers and rakes, getting rid of a very valuable resource. And it's not just what the leaves will do for the soil, it's also the leaves provide a lot of winter habitat for many species of insects. So a lot of those 413 species of caterpillars that will come and feed lightly on your oaks, when they are ready to mature and become adults, they will drop down to the ground and they will pupate in the leaf litter. There are other insects, for example, fireflies, which are predatory beetles, spend their entire lives in leaf litter, both as larvae and as adults. And their favorite food are slugs. The acorns are easily accessed and stored by many mammals, particularly some rodents like squirrels and chipmunks, and birds like the jays and other corvids, and insects even. There are a number of different weevil species that will drill into the acorn and start feeding on the endosperm, the cotyledon in there that are full of carbohydrates and nutrients that are there to support the young tree right after the acorns grow. And we even have some bees that use white oak pollen in the early spring. So there are a lot of things to recommend the oaks in terms of their functioning in the ecosystem. And I encourage you to not rake your leaves. Raking your leaves and mulching them and then putting the mulch back is just a lot of extra effort that you don't need to go through and is really not all that good for your ecosystem. So just let them lay where they are. If they fall on your lawn, Scott's recommends that you not rake the leaves. It recommends that you mulch those leaves and let them fall into the down inside the grass blades and condition your soils. And they say that you can do it with up to 18 inches of leaves. So there's really no reason to rake your leaves. And the leaves, as they decompose, are good for the soils, and they make a great mulch for your beds around your trees, as well as your other flower beds. And no, they do not impede your flowers from coming up in the spring. There are a couple of myths. You may have heard that oaks are difficult. One myth is that oaks grow slowly. So this picture shows a tree, a 15-year-old oak tree. It was planted by a squirrel in my yard, and I just said, okay, that's not a bad place to have a northern red oak. And I let it grow, and this is what it looked like in 15 years. That is a standard 5-gallon bucket. In nature, oaks will grow slowly in the shade. They're what foresters call a gap regenerative species. So the acorns germinate, the tree starts growing very slowly, and what they're waiting for is one of the mature canopy species to die and create a gap in the canopy that'll allow a lot of light to get through. And once they get that, then they can take off and grow pretty quickly to try and dominate that gap. So, contrary to what a lot of people think, oaks are not a very shade tolerant species. You want to plant them where they're going to get, if not full sun, at least 3/4 of the day sun. They need that sun. And if you give it to them, they can grow pretty fast, even this northern red oak. To give you an example of that, these are what we call white oak. These are what we call tree cookies. They're from two white oaks that were growing in pretty much the same site. They're about 20 feet from each other. They're cut the same day at the same height. The one on the right was growing in the shade of the parent tree. The one on the left was fortunate enough to have germinated under an ash tree that was already dying from emerald ash borer. So by the time we got up there to make these tree cookies, this is from the Conway Robinson State Forest, it was growing in full sun. So you can see the effect of giving your oak trees sun can have on the rate of growth. Another thing about oaks that you may have heard is that they're difficult to transplant. Supposedly, you should only transplant them in the spring, and they are notorious for failing. They have over a 50% failure rate, some species as much as a 90% failure rate. Quercus muhlenbergii is one of those that has a really bad reputation. That's the chinkapin oak. However, while these statements are true, they need a caveat because this is based on trying to transplant trees like the one in the picture. For those of you who know me, I'm about 6 feet tall. So those are pretty good sized trees. Turns to be perfectly honest, those are red maples, not oaks. But I'm talking about the size of the tree. The research that I have read indicates that if you plant smaller stock, trees that are 1 inch or less in caliper, you don't have these problems. You can transplant them in the fall. They're going to have a very high survival rate. In fact, one study up at Cornell University for the tree that was done with Quercus muhlenbergii, which is, again, one of those species that's supposed to be really hard to transplant, but the ones that were less than 1 inch caliper had a 99% survival rate. I think one of them failed, whereas the 2 inch and larger all failed. So the message is plant oaks, but buy small stock. And of course, the other advantage is those smaller stock trees are a lot cheaper than those 2 inch diameter trees that are going to be problematic. So given that, let's look at some of the species out there. One of the common ones that I've mentioned this already is white oak, Quercus alba. You can look at the picture on the right there, and you can see they can become very big trees. But keep in mind that tree is probably started growing sometime in the late 19th century. So it's 120, 130 years old. And what that means then is if you plant a white oak today, it may become a problem for somebody a long time from now. Oaks also have a bad rap for not being very pretty. That's why everybody wants to plant the maples. But as you can see from the picture on the left, if we get the right weather, they can be very pretty and have a lot of great fall color. The red colors are sugars that are produced in the fall. And so we have to have the right kind of weather. I don't know if you noticed that some years we get a lot of really bright red fall foliage, and other years not so much. I've noticed that in my yard. And that's because if we get bright sunny days and cool nights, that will set up the conditions for the tree to be producing these red chemicals. Otherwise, it's just yellow and orange. Another great yard tree, and this is one that you see in the trade a lot, is swamp white oak, Quercus bicolor. It's called that because the top of the leaf is kind of dark green and the bottom of the leaf is almost white. It's a very, very light green. This is another tree, gets to be every bit as big as that white oak that I showed you. And as you can see from the picture on the right, it can have very good color. That tree does not have a good form, but it's another good tree to consider for your yard. One of the more common urban trees, we see this a lot, particularly in commercial landscapes, is the willow oak, Quercus fellows. This is a faster growing oak. That tree is roughly 60 years old. I have an aerial photograph that's in my yard, and I have an aerial photograph of my lot, which was completely clear in 1963. That tree wasn't there. So it's grown quite a bit in the 60 years that it's been there. This one, like all the other oaks that I've mentioned, really has very few problems in terms of lethal diseases. There's a lot of stuff out there that will nibble on your oak, but there's nothing that will nibble it to death. Another one is a scarlet oak, Quercus coccinea. This is probably the fastest growing of the oaks in the wild. Typically, when a site is taken over by oaks, it's the scarlet oaks that dominate first. They do have a shorter lifespan than most of the other big oaks, but by shorter, I mean 75 to 90 years as opposed to 150 to 200 years. They look very similar to the next oak I'm going to show you, which is the plant that actually inspired this whole series. If you look at the leaf there, notice that the lower sinuses are coming around and almost closing. The points from the two lobes are pointing towards each other. That gives it a C shape, which distinguishes it from the pin oak, which has more of a U shape. And this is the pin oak, Quercus palustris. This is the one oak that I do have a caveat on. You can see from the picture that the lower branches are actually growing down towards the ground. In an open setting, this tree wants to have a big oval canopy that starts about 1.5 to 2 feet off the ground. So while it's great for the middle of your yard, it's not something you want to plant in a place where in the future, you may want to be moving around underneath the tree. And so this is a discussion I had with Carol back at that festival in McLean, where they planted one of these because they wanted to have the petting zoo around it. And I pointed out that there were going to be problems with clearance. And while an oak was a perfectly good choice, if you want to do stuff under it, this is not what you want to plant. and a couple of smaller oaks, the blackjack oak. This is Quercus marylandica. This tree has all the advantages of that I mentioned in terms of the ecosystem function, as well as some of the advantages that you get from planting an oak in your yard from the first slide. But this is a tree for small space that generally, if you're looking for a tree for a small space like a townhouse, this would be a species of oak that you can use. The other one that I'll mention is the dwarf chinkapin oak, also called the dwarf chestnut oak. Um, these two trees both have a stature roughly equivalent to a dogwood or a redbud. And don't be fooled by the name. There is something called a chinkapin oak. There is something called a chestnut oak. This is not a dwarf variety of either of those. This is a separate species. But the blackjack oak and the chinkapin oak, and there are a couple of others that are native to the eastern United States. There are a lot of small stature oaks that you find out west. Those actually grow more like shrubs, but these are the ones that are native here. So with that, I will entertain questions. I will stop sharing and let's see. Let's open the chat. Okay. So Jim's asked, do we have to be very precise? Oh, we talked about that. James, I have recently moved back to Maine from Virginia. We haven't had EMB here yet. Oh, emerald ash borer. We want to replace an ash tree planted by my grandfather, lost to a storm. Is there any not? There are, to my knowledge, no EAB resistant trees, ash trees or ash species out there that are native. The Siberian ashes or the ashes from Northeast Asia are fairly resistant to the EAB because they evolved with them. Oh, so Tara asked, can you speak to allergy or asthma concerns with oaks and how to address those when talking with concerned landowners? Are oaks any more or less worse for allergies and asthma? So oaks are wind pollinated, and they can in the spring when everything turns green, they're part of that. There are other trees that are not such a big problem. Maples are not quite as big a problem because they're both insect and wind pollinated. And then trees like tulip poplars are insect pollinated. So it really depends on whether it's a wind pollinated or an insect pollinated. For a long time, I told people that if you grow up in an area with trees, you are much less likely to have asthma. There is now some research which indicates that living with trees can trigger asthma attacks, but they also moderate the asthma attacks. So they're not as bad. So if you already have asthma, your attacks will not be as severe. As far as the pollen allergies, there's nothing we can do about that. Other than to say, it doesn't really matter whether that oak tree is in your yard or your neighbor's yard. You're going to get the pollen anyway. That's the whole purpose of wind pollination is it goes everywhere and it's going to be out there. So you might as well get the benefits from the tree in your yard and just deal with the pollen. That's what I do. I'm allergic to tree pollen. Um, Carrie has a 4-year-old mulin Bergie that is over 12 feet tall in Falls Church. So, like I said, if you put it in the right place in your yard, if you give it sun, oak trees grow as fast or almost as fast as any other tree. Do oaks cause any concerns with their roots growing into sewer lines, particularly if planted too close to the house? Um, Oaks have no greater concern than other trees. And here's the thing about tree roots getting into sewer lines. Sewer lines are generally 4 feet or more below ground because otherwise they would freeze in the winter. They have to be put in below the frost line. Trees normally do not send roots down there. However, if your sewer line is already leaking, the trees will follow that plume of nutrient-rich water down, find that defect in your sewer line and get into it. And it doesn't matter what species you're talking about. But that is becoming less and less of a problem as we go to the PVC sewer lines. I had problems with tree roots in my sewer line, but that's because my sewer, when the house was built, was basically rolled tar paper, and it had a 20-year warranty, and it was already over 50 years old. And the trees didn't so much grow into it as it just dissolved. But I had found a company that could pull a new sewer line through that void that's PVC pipe and didn't have to dig that big trench through the yard, because if they'd had to do that, my red maple would be dead, because it would have come within about, the trench would have been within about 3 feet of the base of the tree. So trees get a bad rap because humans think they know everything and how to do everything. The problem is the sewer starts leaking and starts to fail, and that's when the tree roots get into it. So you said home sites have compacted soil, which no tree loves. Does this improve over time naturally? Is there anything we can do about it? Convert turf to plants? Leave the leaves? What else? Those are all good solutions to it. Soil compaction will naturally abate over time. The more organic matter you put into your soil, the faster that will happen. Obviously, if we already have a big tree in your yard, you don't want to try and decompact the soil mechanically because you're going to mess up the root system. When we moved into our house, we had no A horizon. The A horizon is that dark soil at the top that most people think of as topsoil, although topsoil goes a little deeper than that. The last time I planted something in my front yard, I had 4 inches of an A horizon. And that's from 20 years of leaves just letting lay and decomposing in place. Do you advocate applied nucleation? I would have to say I do not, because I don't know what applied nucleation is. So I really can't address that question. I may advocate for it. I just don't know that I am advocating. Because Carrie, you want to enlighten me? What's applied
Sure.
nucleation?
Yeah, thanks. It's dense plantings. You kind of plant. So, for example, at our church in Vienna, you've been there, Jim, Holy Comforter. We've put
Oh,
a few deer exclosures, a 50-foot section of fence. So it's about I don't know, a 15-foot diameter exclosure. And inside that, we planted about 30 plants. So 3 trees, three to 5 shrubs, bunch of forbs and some ground cover. The idea is, with the exclosure fence, that you get this dense growth of plants and they're competing with each other to an extent, um, but they're protected. And so the idea is that they really kind of flourish together. And once they mature enough, then they start to expand outside that exclosure.
Yeah. Certainly if I understood correctly, how big the exclosure is, I don't think you overplanted. I know there are some places out there which are talking about, we're going to plant trees within 5 feet of each other. And so far, I haven't seen results from somebody who did this 30 or 40 years ago. All the data seems to be in the last 10, maybe 15 years. And I would expect those trees to survive. But at some point, they're going to start crowding each other out, and there is going to be competition for sunlight. So, that's one way of doing it. If you got the money and resources, you can plant really densely and let the trees thin themselves out. Or you can plant less densely and hope you get a longer 50-year survival rate. So for example, and this is, kind of my thinking about this is, I have seen sites. I saw a site down at the Appomattox Buckingham State Forest where they had cleared it, and it was near a tulip poplar seed site, and the tulip poplars germinated and grew in at 75,000 stems per acre. Now, 50 years from then, yeah, I would expect it's going to be down to more like 75 stems per acre, which is a 99.9% failure rate. So if you're planting and that's acceptable, I think that, that'll work. But I don't think the long-term effects that they think they're going to be getting are really going to happen. But what you talked about with a few trees and shrubs and forbs, that's great. Get rid of, completely move the turf out and put those plants in, and that will help everything.
Yeah, this is in the forest, so there's no
Yeah.
turf. Yeah.
Okay. Ellen, when planting oaks or other native trees, is it important that they are sourced locally versus another region? That's a tricky question because it depends on what you mean by locally. I would say, yes, you should get trees that are sourced locally. When the Department of Forestry had failures with their eastern white pine crop, for example, they would go and purchase from a place that had a climate that was pretty much identical to where they grew them in Cremona. On the other hand, especially with planting oaks, I think, if you talk about sourcing locally to mean in Northern Virginia, I would encourage, try and get some trees from a little further south, just to account for what's likely to be happening to the climate over their lifetime. So if you get them from a nursery in North Carolina and you get them small and young, that should be fine. But yeah, I know there is a debate. I know last week, Charles Smith talked about assisted migration, and I had signed up for it and then forgot about it. And so I didn't see his presentation. But I'm reading this new book called Oak Origins, and there is some indication that perhaps after the last ice age, human beings did assist in the migration of particularly oaks and walnuts and hickories, trees that they found to be very useful, that was providing food in terms of nuts and things. So Next question. Will oak planted within several feet of Atlantis be adversely affected by chemicals in the soil from the roots of that tree? The best indication, the best science I've seen is no, provided you're not planting an acorn. So what Atlantis does is it produces chemicals that can inhibit germination. But once the tree is established, it's not using chemical warfare against other trees. This gets blown out of proportion. There are some things like you don't want to plant nightshade family plants under black walnuts. So don't put your tomato patch under your black walnut tree. Not only do those chemicals inhibit the tomatoes, but also they're going to be dropping very large seeds on your tomato plants if they survive. But I don't think there should be that much of a problem. Of course, what you want to do is kill the Atlantis first before you plant the oak. Peter asks, would it be good to plant oaks like a squirrel, as in randomly close and far apart, or in a couple of as in a couple of seedlings within a couple of feet of each other? The roots will intertwine, or will they eventually just knock each other out? Yeah, as we said earlier about the applied nucleation, I think it really depends on how much competition and how much failure you're willing to accept down the road. They'll grow like that pretty close together. And we see that out in the woods all the time, but eventually one of them is going to dominate and the others are going to fall out. So you can do whatever you want in terms of how you plant them. Just be aware that if you're thinking about what the site's going to look like in 50 years, competition is going to be part of that. Carabelle, to everyone, here is a helpful handout on street trees and sewer laterals from Pennsylvania Horticultural Society. And what about ambrosia beetles? In my neighborhood, they have killed scores of chestnut oaks. Yes and no. Remember, I talked about primary and secondary pests. Ambrosia beetle in oaks is a secondary pest. So the reason it's killed lots of chestnuts and the reason it's killed a lot of chestnut oaks and not other oaks is because the chestnut oaks are particularly susceptible to the oak decline syndrome. And the ambrosia beetles are kind of like the last step. That's the last nail in the coffin. That tree was already mostly dead when the ambrosia beetle got into it. They are the secondary pests. So if your trees are healthy, they're not going to be a problem. It's only when your trees are not healthy. Wouldn't planting so densely prevent invasives from getting a foothold? That is partially true. If you are growing dryland, in my experience, where you have dryland oaks dominating, you don't have invasive plants. I've been out in the woods where I'm walking up the hill and then all of a sudden, boom, the stilt grass and all the other invasives start, and I look up and I'm looking at just white oaks and chestnut oaks. I don't think many of the invasives can take the soil conditions that particularly the white and chestnut oaks. They are the two best at dealing with those dry and fertile sites. But yeah, they could crowd them out. On the other hand, it depends on which invasives you're you're talking about. I have a dense stand of gray dogwood, and I was looking in there one day, and I found a wing burning bush growing in the middle of it. So if it's a truly invasive plant, it's probably going to be able to move in no matter how densely you plant. That's been my experience, unfortunately. Some other things like stilt grass are not going to get in there, but most of the others, if a seed gets in there, it'll germinate and it'll grow. Okay, my computer is telling me my battery's about to die. I didn't think we'd be on this long. So, are there any other questions? All right. Well, that's all I have for you tonight. And you are welcome. Carol and Barbara and whoever and I will work that out. Remember to let Carol know if there is a specific topic or a specific tree you want to hear more about. We can work that out.
Yes, thank you very much, Jim. That was really very interesting. So we will put the recording on our website. But give us a week or two to do that. And and we will let you know when we have a next meeting. Thank you very much.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. Good night.
Good night.